Today, my guest is author Jonathan Eig. We will be talking to him about his new biography, Get Capone, the secret plot that captured America's most wanted gangster from Simon & Schuster. Jonathan Eig is a former writer, well, a current writer, but a former writer and editor for the Chicago Bureau of the Wall Street Journal and the former executive editor of Chicago Magazine. He's the author of two highly acclaimed New York Times bestsellers, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. Luckiest Man won the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of 2005, and Opening Day was selected as one of the best books of 2007 by the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and Sports Illustrated. Jonathan lives in Chicago with his wife and children. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Are you in Chicago as we speak?
No, I'm actually in Vancouver on vacation.
Oh, well, good for you.
Thanks.
I'm glad to hear that. Nice part of Canada.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Okay, Jonathan, we're going to get started, and we're going to ask you to, first of all, give us a brief overview of the book.
Well, it's the real story of Al Capone. I tried to strip away the myths and figure out who this guy really was and how he came to power and how he became this iconic figure, but also to try to set him in his context and to show how Prohibition made a two-bit thug into this incredibly rich and powerful man, and then why the government became so intent on taking him down. It really became an issue that went all the way to the White House, where you had President Herbert Hoover giving the order that he wanted to see Capone put away no matter what it took. So it's part biography, part manhunt, and I think it's the first book that really gets at the truth behind the story of Al Capone.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and I think my audience would be interested to know why you chose to write this familiar story.
Well, I've written about Lou Gehrig before and Jackie Robinson, and it occurred to me that these are American icons, people who've become myths almost in this country, and Al Capone fit into that category too. And I think that sometimes in our culture we have a tendency to mythologize these people and lose sight of their humanity. And I think history really is best served when you understand the people you're writing about and tell their stories in the context that they deserve. And that's what I set out to do with Capone.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting too to tell the story as it relates to the times. I think that's an important aspect. Also, people kind of lose track of that. Now, in your book, you talk about the hero who was instrumental in the case. Tell us his name and tell us about him.
Yeah, his name is George E.Q. Johnson, and he's the U.S. Attorney for Chicago, the man who is in charge of prosecuting federal crimes in Chicago, and he's taking his orders directly from the President, Herbert Hoover. But George Johnson is a very strange guy. He's not sort of a gung-ho cowboy type. He's very shy, very retiring, and doesn't want any publicity. Eliot Ness is out there trying to get headlines for his work and accomplishing nothing. Eliot Ness is really not the hero at all in the case against Capone. It's this shy, insecure man named George Johnson who has to decide whether he's willing to bring a phony case against Capone or whether he really wants to stick to the facts and make a true, legitimate case. And he chooses the more conservative approach and decides that he's going to put all his money behind this tax case, which was a very controversial decision, and the federal government was not exactly thrilled with Johnson's tactics in this. They were worried that Capone was going to slip away.
Now, so he knew, is that correct, that he knew it was a phony case?
Yeah, George Johnson knew that many of the charges against Capone were trumped up and were, at the very best, were incredibly weak. Some of the tax charges against Capone that he eventually went to jail for were really misdemeanors and probably should not have been prosecuted as felonies. Also, the statutes of limitations on some of these charges had expired, and the federal government just wanted to pull ahead with this thing no matter what, regardless of the facts.
Now, you mentioned Eliot Ness and the Untouchables, and certainly we're all familiar with Eliot Ness, and movies and series and everything was made about him. How come he got so much credit if Mr. Johnson was the real man behind the legend?
It's interesting with Eliot Ness because he got a lot of publicity in Chicago at the time of the investigation of Capone. You know, he was out there calling the newspaper reporters and organizing photographers to show up every time he broke into a brewery. But then he went away, and nobody heard his story. The books and the movies and the TV shows came much, much later, and it's funny what happened. And he really hired a good ghostwriter, is what it amounts to. After writing his memoirs, he found a ghostwriter to help him embellish those memoirs. And this ghostwriter did such an amazing job, but what he ended up with resembled the truth only very faintly.
Huh. Well, maybe this will get the word out there a little more.
I'm hoping
your
that
book.
We can correct some of those.
Yeah, exactly. Talk about the circumstances that prompted this war on crime, and who was the man behind it. Like you say, it went all the way to the White House, so I think our audience knows who it was. But get into a few more details about that.
Well, you have to remember in the 1920s when Capone was really establishing himself. The Prohibition was the law, but it was an incredibly unpopular law. So the system really broke down, and you had all kinds of people who were really comfortable breaking the law after a while. So you had people drinking all the time, and as a result of that, people were willing to look the other way when these bootleggers went into business and opened up these brothels. So, Herbert Hoover is elected to office, and the economy is booming. He's really got nothing else to worry about, so he focuses on crime control. Just like in the 70s and 80s, politicians love talking about how they're going to fight crime.
Right.
Because it makes them look tough, and that's what Herbert Hoover did. He said, I'm going to enforce the Prohibition laws, whether we like it or not, and I'm going to clean up the justice system. And he planned to really reform the entire justice system, and as a gesture, a symbolic gesture, really, to show what he was doing, he decided to make this case against Capone and to seek really this high-profile prosecution, just like we sometimes make a boogeyman out of certain criminals as a way of showing that we're going to be tough on crime.
Now, some of my listeners might not be familiar with Prohibition. Could you give a little brief explanation of what that was and why those laws were enacted?
Sure. I mean, very few people today are alive who
right.
remember Prohibition. But during World War I, this movement swept the country, and it was tied up with the suffrage movement. Women getting the vote. Also said, while we're at it, we should really stop the drinking that is destroying this country. The drinking was contributing to crime. It was contributing to joblessness. And people felt that that this country would be a better place. We'd be healthier and wealthier if we could stop people from abusing alcohol so much.
And there was some famous woman whose name I can't grab hold of in my head right now who brought her women into these places and smashed it up. Isn't that right?
Carrie Nation,
yeah,
thinking of.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, there were quite a few. It was a religious movement, it was a social movement, and it became, incredibly forceful. And you have to remember, too, that it really was passed during World War I when the nation was in the mood to sacrifice. People
True.
felt like they had to make compromises to keep the country strong. But by the time it became the law, 1920, the whole world had changed, and people were not interested in being in sacrificing anymore. They wanted a party.
Yeah.
So it became an incredibly unpopular law almost from the minute that it took hold, and there was no way for the government to enforce it. And it gave rise to people like Al Capone. These gangsters suddenly not only were willing to break crime, to break the law, but they were able to make incredible money because they took over these businesses that were now considered illegal.
I think probably most people, maybe not, but many people might know of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that we all believed until this book that he was responsible for. So first of all, tell my listeners what the St. Valentine's Massacre was and when that happened.
Sure, it was 1929 on St. Valentine's Day, and 7 members of one of Al Capone's rival gangs, the Moran Gang, on the north side were in a garage on Clark Street in Chicago. And in the morning of Valentine's Day, they were gunned down brutally. 7 men killed in this garage. And everybody assumed that it had something to do with the gang wars. The North Siders and the South Siders were shooting it out all the time. But the crime went unsolved. And at first they thought police did it. There was some evidence to suggest that the police had actually murdered these gang members. Then there were other gangs from Detroit and St. Louis were suspected. But the longer it went unsolved, eventually people just assumed that it must have been Al Capone, even though he was never charged, he was never questioned. In fact, none of his gang members were ever charged with the crime. But over time, history has just sort of connected him to it because he was the biggest figure in Chicago. Everybody assumed he must have had something to do with it.
And a lot of the films, Hollywood portrayed it in a lot of films about that period of the 1920s. So all of that perpetuated it as well. And I'm assuming, too, that at that period of time, the murder of 7 people, just gunned down so viciously, was really a shocking situation to the people.
That was a big part of why this crime became so notorious. There were gang murders in Chicago and in all the cities all the time, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds a year. But this 7 people at one time was shocking. Also, the fact is that the newspaper photographers got some stunning photos, and those photos appeared on the front pages of newspapers nationwide, and that horrified people. And that crime really was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the thing that everybody said, okay, enough is enough. We've got to do something. And I think that really lit a fire under the prosecutors to make sure to put Capone out of business finally. Even though, as I argue in this book, I think it's highly unlikely that Capone had anything to do with it. And in fact, I have a new theory based on some FBI records that I discovered that suggests that the crime was really just a crime of revenge. The men in the garage there had killed another man, and his family came after the boys in the garage.
Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, now when you think about it, it makes sense.
Have some aggression and some passion behind them. It's very unusual to kill 7 people in a cold, calculating way, and there were innocent people killed in the garage that day. Capone didn't operate that way.
Yeah. How much time went by? Now, there's this assumption that he was involved in it. How much time went by before they put the case together against him?
Well, the Valentine's Day Massacre was in 1929, and Capone was indicted in 1930 and was tried in 1931. He was never charged with the Valentine's Day Massacre. He was never even questioned in regard to that crime. But the tax case against him finally went to trial in the fall of 1931. So that's really the end of Capone's criminal career, 1931, and he was only 32 years old at that point, still a very young man.
I want to talk a little bit about the trial, but whose idea was it? Was it actually Hoover that decided to take this approach to go after him for his taxes? And just mention that quickly.
Yeah, I think George Johnson, the prosecutor, had some leeway in deciding which charges he thought would be the best to bring.
Okay, so he
decided that the tax case was their best bet.
And I read in some of the material that I got along with the book that at one point the government estimated his annual income to be $95 million, the equivalent of $1.2 billion today. But he did live a pretty frugal life. And were you able to ever determine whether those figures were correct or whether it was just something that they put together for this tax thing?
Yeah, I think the federal government wildly exaggerated Capone's income to try to make him look bigger than he really was. Now, I wouldn't say Capone lived frugally. He still had, nice homes and nice clothes, and a fancy bulletproof car. That's not exactly frugal, but
right.
To have earned billions of dollars.
What was it? 1.2 billion in today's terms.
He certainly wasn't living that way. Maybe his organization brought in that kind of money. Gross income, but certainly not net. Because bribing the entire Chicago Police Department is expensive. So
yeah,
he had a lot of overhead.
What were some of the other things that he was his group were involved with besides the liquor business? And
liquor was probably their biggest source of income, and there were peripheral businesses like gambling, running brothels, and some of the tracks, some of the horse racing tracks. Those were all Capone businesses as well, and really almost anything that moved in Chicago.
Yeah,
it was off the books. Had a piece of it.
You mentioned that you've been hearing from a lot of people that were relatives of some of these guys involved, and quickly just talk about what their response has been to the book.
Oh, it's been fascinating. I've heard from some of the Capones. I've heard from some of the Gusenberg grandchildren. Jaime Weiss's ancestors. It's been really interesting, and for the most part, they've been satisfied with the book. I think they feel like, even though I've described their grandparents as really brutal criminals, that I've put their lives in context, that I've explained how they got to be criminals at a time when it was just too tempting to resist.
Yeah, well, and it also has to be tough going through life with the name of Capone when he's really historically known.
Yes, many of these Capones have changed their names, but I think enough time has passed that some of them are willing to talk about it and to deal with it, and they're eager to see the story told correctly after all these years of demonizing these guys.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a couple of things about evidence, and I think the most important thing that you were involved with regarding all of this were letters. Is that right? From that you found some letters between he and his family that led you to some new conclusions?
Yeah, in writing this book on Capone, I came across many sources of new information. Some of them from the federal government, the records that the prosecutors used in going after Capone. I also found Capone's tax records for the first time. Got the IRS to release some of those. But probably the most interesting personal stuff I found were Capone's letters from Alcatraz and from the Atlanta penitentiary where he served for 4 years, where he writes to his family about his condition, about his life, and about his feelings. He apologizes for the pain that he brought to the family, and it shows him as a very complex human being.
Now, you also mentioned FBI evidence. Is that what you're referring to now in something you just said about the tax stuff? And was that the FBI evidence that you found that suggested he was not behind it?
Yeah, the FBI evidence was a letter that suggested that somebody in Chicago knew who really committed the Valentine's Day massacre.
Really?
And he was writing to J. Edgar Hoover saying that you really ought to investigate this guy because I know what went on. I know why he went after the Moran gang. I know why those 7 men died in the garage. And the feds just ignored it. They had no interest in pursuing it because it wasn't a federal crime, and it was a can of worms they didn't really want to open.
And where did you find this?
It's actually available for anybody who wants to see it on the FBI website now.
No kidding.
These things were buried deep in their files for many, many years, but then just recently, in the last few years, the FBI has started putting a lot of these things up on their website so that the public can peruse them at will, and that's a great resource to researchers like me.
Well, I'll say
you can dig through this stuff without getting out of your pajamas.
Well, the whole idea that it's sitting there on a website is amazing. Maybe organizations like the FBI that, and maybe someday the CIA or something will have a website and come out with stuff like that, because there's always talk about in trials and everything about, the other side of things. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Now, he did have a trial. The letters, of course, were written from prison, but he did have a trial, and he was sent to prison. And I think the assumption now is that he was an innocent man.
Well, he was certainly not innocent in most ways. He was guilty of many, many crimes. Yeah, the irony is that he went to jail for the least of those crimes, tax evasion. And I think he was guilty of tax evasion too. He didn't pay his taxes. There's no question about that. And he felt like, well, why should I pay taxes when all my income is illegal? If I pay taxes, I'm basically going to be admitting that I'm breaking the law. So
that kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
Catch-22. What would you do, right?
Yeah,
if all your money was illegal, would you report it on your taxes?
Right.
You probably wouldn't. You'd take your chances. So his decision was rational, but obviously it got him in a lot of trouble. And the real problem with his trial wasn't his innocence or guilt. It was the severity of his sentence and the way the trial was handled. And there were some really egregious violations of the law and of ethics during his trial. And I think that the judge and the prosecutor really stuck it to Capone in ways that he was completely unprepared for, and his lawyers never saw coming.
So it was. Would you say it was a setup then? I mean, were they all in cahoots to get this guy, or was he just so despised because of everything that he was doing in Chicago that the whole thing was tainted?
I think he was railroaded to some extent.
Yeah.
I hate to be an apologist for this guy, but, our system is built on the laws, and everybody's entitled, even Al Capone is entitled to a fair trial, and I don't think he got one. I think that the evidence against him was much of it should have been declared inadmissible. The trial should have been moved to another jurisdiction because, he could not get a fair trial in Chicago. The jury was rigged in many ways. The judge handpicked this jury full of men that he knew were inclined to convict. And then he overlooked several pieces of law that I think could have really reduced Capone's sentence to a couple of years. He ended up getting 11 years for income tax evasion, which was unheard of at the time. It's still pretty rare.
Yeah. The other thing we were discussing during the break, too, were some of the, again, talk about some of the other things that they were involved with during that period in the 20s, because I guess certainly there's a lot of criminals that were taking advantage of the system. So what were some of the other things that he and his organization were involved with, some of the crimes?
Well, they started with the bootlegging and the casinos and the brothels, and they began to expand really late in Capone's career. They began to look at other businesses. They began to get into the rackets and the labor unions, and this is the stuff that would make the mafia so powerful in the next generation.
Yes.
By the 50s, they would be controlling, these massive national unions, and they would be moving into Vegas and moving into the Caribbean, and really becoming this massive power. But that was just starting in Capone's, at the last stages of Capone's career, and he never really got into it himself personally. I think that, by comparison, the Capone organization was fairly quaint in that it was really local and never, but he did start to dabble in some of the labor unions. The dry cleaning business was mafia controlled, some of the others in Chicago, but he was not the great visionary who expanded the mafia and turned it into what we think of today. He was really pretty much a beer and booze and gambling kind of guy.
Yeah, but there were also a lot of murders going on, weren't there? They were killing off their rivals and that kind of thing. It seems like you always see a lot of photographs from that period.
Yeah, there certainly were, and it was almost always over turf. You had different gangs that were trying to sell beer in different neighborhoods, and they would bump into each other, and the bullets would start flying. And on average, there were 60, 75 murders a year in the gang wars in Chicago.
Oh, my. Wow.
And in the entire period of Prohibition, not one conviction.
Is that right?
The courts were completely corrupt, and that's why the federal government had to go after Capone the way they did, to show that this corruption was not going to be tolerated.
Amazing. Well, let's talk a little bit about the period of the 1920s. I think when we talk about the 1920s, we think about flappers and smoking and drinking and women in short hair and dancing and everything else. So what was it about this period, the 20s, that made Capone such a tolerated figure, and what was it about his personal side that created the spotlight for him?
Well, as you said, the 20s, you had these people sitting on flagpoles. It was a celebrity culture. It was really the first time that the nation became obsessed with fame and celebrity, just for the sake of fame and celebrity. You had people like Babe Ruth, who were not just ball players anymore, but stars. And Charles Lindbergh and all these people who wanted attention. Capone really fit into that mold. He loved the spotlight, and he was always talking to reporters. Gangsters were not supposed to do that. People committing crimes usually tried to keep a low profile, but not Capone. He loved the attention, and that was a big part of his iconic status. And that's why I think we know him today, and we don't talk about the great gangsters of Philadelphia, Boston, or New York as much. Because Capone was the one who really put himself in the public eye. And
you talk about the fact that he had a likable personality, that he was very outgoing and gregarious, and
that's right. He was a very affable guy, as long as you weren't on the wrong side of a business deal or in a gunfight. He was quite charming in his own way, and people and newspaper reporters loved him. I mean, Damon Runyon would go fishing and gambling with him, and Damon Runyon, supposedly some of the Capone relatives believe that the Guys and Dolls characters are based on Capone and his brothers, because the reporters just couldn't get enough of this guy.
Well, that it seems like even in modern times, the mafia guys are people that the public's very fascinated with. Yep, even when they're trying to catch them and they're annoyed about it, they're still. I mean, look at John Gotti and the great dresser and charming guy that he was, and people would follow him around. And
That's right. That's why I wrote this book, I think, because Capone still fascinates us, and I wanted to try to figure out why.
Why? Yeah.
And I wanted to figure out why, who the man really was, and where that fascination comes from, not just the movies. I wanted to really get at the historical truth.
I'd like you to talk about he was imprisoned in Atlanta and then moved to Alcatraz, and it's funny because I've read stuff about him and didn't remember that that's where he started out in Atlanta because he's so connected with Alcatraz, and I'd like you to talk about that and why he was moved there, and then his terrible medical problems.
Yeah,
that he finally
sent him to Atlanta. First of all, they were prepared to send him to Leavenworth, Kansas, and his brother and some of his other gang members were there. So then they settled on Atlanta. And after 4 years in Atlanta, he was a model prisoner. There was no reason to move him. But the federal government under FDR opened Alcatraz as a federal prison, and they wanted to show the American public that this was going to be the world's toughest prison. And what better way to do that than by sending the most famous prisoner in America up there? So they put Capone on a train and shipped him to Alcatraz. So it was really another example of the government using Capone as kind of a scapegoat or as a symbol of crime and their toughness on crime. And Capone, while he was in Atlanta, was diagnosed with syphilis. So he was really, his mind was already going by this time, and he really was not even attempting to control his criminal organization anymore. He was just trying to stay out of trouble and to try to find some kind of medical relief, which was not available. He was too far gone. By the time he was diagnosed, the syphilis was already destroying his brain.
Yeah.
And he still had moments of clarity, but he also had moments where he was like a babbling child, and he suffered seizures. And it was a very sad end. His life for the last 15 years or so was pathetic.
Well, now you said that Alcatraz opened under FDR. So was he? Did he have to give the okay to move him there?
Yeah, I believe it came from. I don't know if FDR personally was involved, but certainly from his head of his
under his administration,
prison.
though.
Yes, that's right. And I think it was definitely a move that the federal government at the highest level orchestrated in order to bring more good publicity for their new prison.
Yeah. Now, very quickly, you've been quoted as saying that you had fun writing about him. Why? Briefly.
Well, he's a fascinating character, and there's so much great action, there's so much blood, and so much booze, and there's these fascinating women who hang around these characters. The baseball books that I've written before on Gehrig and on Robinson were a lot of fun, and there's great action there too. But this is a different kind of action, and I really enjoyed describing it.
Yeah. Was he a party guy?
Capone was definitely a party guy. He was a manly guy. He liked to go gambling and drinking with his pals, and he would disappear for weeks at a time, and his wife wouldn't know where he was, and he'd come back, with lavish gifts for her, and everything would be okay. And he definitely was a good time guy.
But he always had ladies on his arm, right?
Yes, indeed.
Now, did any of the women that he was involved with become famous as a result of?
No, it was interesting that he never really attracted attention for his nightlife, and I've never seen a picture of him with another woman on his arms. I've never seen a picture of him with his wife on his arm either. But
really,
but no, he was very discreet apparently.
What was his wife like?
She was very shy. She wanted no part of this business that her husband was in, and she really devoted her life to protecting their son and keeping him out of the crime world. And
was she a Chicago gal?
No, she and Capone met when they were growing up in Brooklyn, and they were married very young. She got pregnant, had a child before they were married, and they were married when they were both about 19, 20 years old.
And how many children did they have?
Just the one child.
Just one. Yeah. So all of these Capones are descended from this one child.
From the one child, and also from Capone's brothers and sisters.
Yeah, right. Well, we are out of time. Gosh, this has been so fascinating. What a wonderful, wonderful book. I know you're in Vancouver on vacation. I thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And good luck with the book, and I think it's going to be a popular read. I've been very happy to have had you here.
Nice to talk to you.